And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Rizwan Virk, successful entrepreneur, investor, futurist, and author of the books The Simulation Hypothesis and The Simulated Multiverse. Rizwan, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me. As we were chatting beforehand, I've been a fan of your podcast for a while. I often joke that the only religion people need is to go on YouTube and listen to NDE experiencers talk about, what they saw on the other side. And your podcast is one of the primary ways for people to do that. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored to know that you're actually watching our videos.
Yeah, I've watched many of them. Yeah.
Great. Well, as you may or may not know, many of my near-death experiencers come back with the thought that we live in a simulation or some sort of, simulated environment. And since you would be either, I don't know, the father or the leader of the simulation theory, it's great to have you here today to talk about it.
Well, that's very interesting to me because I think is a lot of overlap, between these two worlds, if you will, worlds of ideas and thoughts and experiences. And for me, I made the connection because I had originally heard about near-death experiencers through a gentleman named Daniel Brinkley, who I don't know if you've had him on your podcast or Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so most people may know of him. He wrote a book called Saved by the Light, which was like a #1 New York Times bestseller back in the 1990s, sold millions of copies. But I had read about many parts of the near-death experience, but the part that had intrigued me the most was the life review. And he had described it as a holographic panoramic life review. And this was, back when there really wasn't much on the internet about near-death experiencers, and podcasts hadn't really been invented yet. But, it always kind of stuck with me, this idea that we could replay every event of our lives, but we could replay it from other people's point of view. And as a computer scientist, I always wonder, well, if something like that is real, how would that be implemented? And the logical answer to that is, well, it's being recorded in a three-dimensional way, and we can then replay it. And so, that was something that had been in the back of my mind. So fast forward a decade or two, I was an entrepreneur in the video game industry. We had the #1 game in the App Store for a while. I sold my company, became an investor, and I was putting on a virtual reality headset and playing a virtual ping pong game. And this was in 2016, so I guess it was a while ago now. It was almost 8 years ago. So the VR technology was not nearly as advanced as it is today with Oculus Quest 3 and Apple's Vision Pro. There were like the wires hanging down from the ceiling, and it was this big, cumbersome headset. And yet the responsiveness of this ping pong game was so good that for a moment, it fooled my body into thinking I was playing a real game of table tennis. So much so that instinctively at the end of the game, I tried to put the paddle down on the table. But of course, there was no table, and the paddle was just my controller. So the controller fell, and I tried to lean against the table just instinctively, and I almost fell over. And that's when I began to wonder, how long will it take for us to build something that is so immersive as a virtual reality that we would be unable to distinguish whether we were in the real world or we were in a virtual world? Basically, how long would it take us to build something like the Matrix, right? And that's what got me down this rabbit hole of simulation theory. And so I came up with these 10 stages of technology we would need to develop to get to the simulation point. But around that same time, I was involved in a company in Silicon Valley. And what we did was we took a video game like League of Legends, if you've ever seen that game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like one of the top esports games, or at least it was at the time. And it's a 3D world where you're competing with other teams of people on this kind of 3D battlefield. But of course, you play it in 2D on your screen. And so what we were able to do, what this startup was able to do, was put on a virtual reality headset and to go back to that game that had been played. And you would feel as if you were literally in the middle of this battlefield, looking around, right? And you could replay the whole game. And we also did this with a game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive, CSGO, which is another one of these top esports games. And in that game, it's a first-person shooter, so you're actually shooting people. And so what we could do is we could show you what it was like to be shot by your character in the game, because you could replay it from any XYZ coordinate and any XYZ t coordinate, if you think of time, right? So you could pick any point in this virtual world at any time, and you could go back to it and you could replay it. And that reminded me of what Daniel Brinkley had said back in the 90s, that when he was in Vietnam, he had shot people because he was in, special forces or whatever. And he had to experience what it was like in his life review to be shot. Now, of course, VR headset is only visual. It doesn't have all the kinesthetic feelings that come in a life review. But that for me was what made the connection, that basically, we must be recording everything that happens in such a way that we're recording not only the visuals, but all of the feelings and sounds associated with it. And then in a life review, we can replay it. And you could only really do that if the world itself was virtual. That would be almost impossible to do in a purely physical world that went on, for billions of light years. But it would be very easy to do in a virtual world. And so that's where, that's kind of my long-winded story with 3 parts there to show, how I got to the overlap of these 2 subjects.
While we're on the subject of life reviews, one of my guests even told me that there were other beings there also experiencing the life review along with him or her. So I think
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that maybe what we do down here is creating experiences for other beings on the other side.
Now, were these other beings?
They were like present, souls, like other light beings.
The souls of people that were in the life review. These were people from or beings from the other side.
Right. I believe it was like light beings or something that were there with him, floating or standing next to him during the life review. But these beings were also experiencing it.
Oh, that's interesting. And were they separate from the guides? Like,
well, maybe they were the guides or something. I don't even remember which podcast it is. But that one outlier out of all the others, I thought was fascinating. That's the only time I ever heard that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of different types of life reviews, and one of the books that people don't know much about is one book that people do know a lot about is Michael Newton's Journey of Souls, where he used hypnotic regression to take people back to the period in between lives. But there was another hypnotherapist from Toronto who in the 70s was doing similar work. And he wrote a book called Life Between Life. So it's not very well known compared to, say, Raymond Moody's, Life After Life, or some of these other near-death experiences. But he talked about having a council of 3 people there, often when he regressed patients to the moments after their death. And I do recall him talking about having multiple beings of light there while they were doing the life review to review the life that had just happened. But it is a fascinating topic, and for me this was also the key to taking the ideas of simulation theory and mapping them to ancient religious ideas in the world's scriptures. And so I grew up as a Muslim, and after I started to write about the simulation hypothesis, I went back to the Islamic scriptures, and I found there was this thing called the Scroll of Deeds. And the Scroll of Deeds is a account of everything you've done in your life. And there are supposedly, within Islamic thought, there are 2 angels. You have the one angel writing down the good deeds and the other angel writing down the bad deeds. And, we have kind of a caricature of this where we have like an angel and a devil on the shoulder, trying to convince us to do good things and bad things. Well, that actually comes from the Islamic tradition, which made its way, into Europe, where they used to say there was an angel and a jinn, right? But the Scroll of Deeds is interesting because these angels, they have names. They're called the Kiramin Katabin, Rakib and Atid, I think, which means like watching and recording or something like that, if you translate the Arabic. And so, these guys are writing down everything that you do, and supposedly maybe even they're writing down your thoughts and your intentions in this book. And then I found a verse in the Quran which said that the day of judgment, I mean, we all think of the day of judgment as this kind of big judgment in the Western Judeo-Christian traditions, going to hell or heaven. But there's actually a verse in the Quran which says that your book will be laid open before you. So you can see the results of your actions. And it also hints at the ripple effect, that you can see what effect these actions had on other people within their lives. And for me, that was an interesting revelation when I read that. And it also said, you yourself are sufficient to be the reckoner, right? Meaning you yourself are there to judge. And again, that matched so much with what I had heard about life reviews, where you can review not only the things that you've experienced, but you could see, you know, for in the case of, say, Daniel, if it was the guy that he shot, he could see what happened to that guy's wife and kids when he didn't come home. And you can see, you know, sort of what we now call the ripple effect, right, of your actions along the way. And so I came to the conclusion, well, most scriptures just use metaphors. And they use those metaphors because they have to describe to the people of the time what these things that are pretty much ineffable, right? Even near-death experiencers say that. They have a hard time putting this into words, even the sequence of things and how they happen. They say, well, I'm describing it as if it happened sequentially, but it seemed like it all kind of happened at the same time. And so all the scriptures, whether it's the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Quran, or you go to the Hindu Vedas or the Buddhist Sutras, you know, they all use metaphors. And so the point that I made last year, I was invited to Birmingham in the UK to speak at an Islamic jurisprudence conference. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You know, why do you want me talking at this conference that consists of Islamic scholars? And there was an Ayatollah there from Iran, literally sitting in the audience, right? And they were all pontificating on things like the beginning of life. You know, when is an abortion permissible? The same kind of arguments we have here. Is it at conception that ensoulment happens? Is it at 40 days? Is it at 120 days? They have all these different ideas within the Islamic tradition, just like we do within the Judeo-Christian traditions of when that happens. And they said, no, we want you to talk about this idea of video games because it makes some of these old metaphors easier to understand. And so one of the points that I made was that the book of deeds, or the scroll of deeds, which, depending on who you ask, translates into the book of life in the Bible and in the Judeo-Christian traditions, although some simplify that to say that's just the book of who will get into heaven. But they also have recording angels. Like in my book, I have a picture from Washington, D.C. of a recording angel in the Christian traditions. I think it's the Archangel Michael who's sitting there and recording down your names. But in some scholars, they say, well, they're writing down more than just your names. They're actually writing down all of the things that you did in your life, which would make it like the scroll of deeds. And so I make the point, the scroll of deeds is a metaphor that could be understood. It doesn't mean there's literally a book with angels with feather pens, you know, writing down, oh, he got up in the morning and he went there. I mean, what language would they write it in? Would they write it in Arabic? Would they write it in Chinese? Would they write it in English? What it really means is just that everything is being recorded. And so today, if the scriptures were to be revealed today, they would say everything is being recorded like a video, like a movie, or, as I like to say, like a video game, like an interactive video game that you could then, you know, use your 3D camera and you could go to any point within the game and you could replay it. And so oddly enough, the life review became, for me, the link between scriptures, you know, and this modern idea of simulation theory.
Well, I'd like to play a game within this game with you, if you don't mind. There are about 4 to 6 outcomes of NDEs, and I want to present these outcomes to you and see how you would explain them within the simulation theory. For example, a certain percentage of people, they immediately go to what we call the black void, where it's just, you know, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I would consider that as maybe somehow you've accidentally logged out of the game or went to a space outside of the game itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would describe it as if you've seen the movie The Matrix, which is, of course, the most popular, you know, science fiction representation of this idea that we live in a video game or a computer simulation. But there are other interesting representations. There was a movie called The 13th Floor, which also came out in the same year as The Matrix. So this year is actually the 25th anniversary of both of those films. It came out in 1999, I think a month or two after The Matrix, and was kind of ignored relative to The Matrix because that ended up being the most talked about movie of the year. But in the Matrix, when they left the Matrix as the main simulation, they Morpheus and Neo were then logged in using almost different cartridges, right? They had this kind of CD or cartridge-based system, and they ended up in a loading area, right? And if you remember, there's a famous scene where all these guns, it's like a complete white area, and then all these guns appear, and they have this famous conversation about, Neo saying, "Is this real?" And Morpheus says, "Well, what do you mean by real? If real is just a set of electrochemical signals to the brain, do you think that's air you're breathing?" But before they actually put, say, the guns or there's a famous scene with the red leather chair with white background that they're in. And so they're not in the Matrix, but they're not outside the Matrix. They're plugged into something. And so I view these as little matrices or little simulations that are set up. But that loading area is basically blank. In the movie, they represented it as white, but that could easily just as easily been represented as black. So I see it as kind of a loading area where you're in between and you haven't gone into this simulation, and we can talk about this as you go through your other five of the six areas, other simulations that might exist beyond this one.
Well, do you feel that we are some sort of non-local consciousness plugging in, or do you think we're an actual being somewhere on the other side using technology to plug in?
Well, that's the big question, right? And I think, you can look at different versions of the simulation hypothesis. So maybe this is a good time to bring this up, because some people view the simulation idea as being antithesis to the idea of religion and souls. And that's because they're forgetting that there's two different versions, or not necessarily versions, but let's say ends of an axis or flavors of the simulation theory. And I call this the NPC versus RPG versions. And so NPC stands for non-player characters. And those are the characters inside a video game which are there, but they don't have any players. They're just like the bartender, the guy at the racetrack with the flags, right? All the other people inside the city that you're running around and maybe beating up or you're asking for help, all the AI controlled characters. And when many academics talk about simulation hypothesis, they're talking about that version, which basically says we're all AI, there's nothing outside the simulation. And it's almost akin to a materialistic view of the world. And then the other flavor is the RPG version, which stands for the role-playing game version, where we are a player and we have a character, or what's called an avatar within the game. And that's the terminology that's used in the video game industry, which actually comes from the Hindu term avatar. And in fact, it was a couple of guys named Chip Morningstar and Randy Farmer in Silicon Valley who were working for George Lucas at Lucasfilm back in the late 80s. They created a game called Habitat, which was one of the first MMORPGs. Really, it was just a 2D game with these little characters on the screen. It wasn't what we think of as like a 3D world, but they were looking for a term to call this little 2D sprite that was your character. And they said they felt like they were a large being that was squeezing into the telephone wires, because this was using Commodore 64s and modems. They were squeezing into this telephone wire, which back then could send like, I don't know if you remember this, but it was like 2400 baud modems, right? It's like literally 2400 bits per second or something like that, which is a very small amount for, as you couldn't even send a JPEG barely at that speed. But they felt like they were squeezing themselves into this wire and then into this tiny little character. And they thought of this term avatar from the Hindu Sanskrit tradition, which means a divinity, a spirit that squeezes itself down into a small body, and as an incarnation of, say, a divine being is what it meant in the Hindu side. And now we use it to just mean the character we are inhabiting inside the video game. And so, your question was, what is it that is outside? Who is the player in essence? I tend to think it's more of a soul. So it's a disincarnated body that wants to have a physical experience. But there are many different versions of simulation theory. And in some of those versions, we are in a simulation that was created by future humans, what's called an ancestor simulation. So if we were to create a simulation of, say, ancient Rome, and then we were to watch the NPCs in there, or we were to go in and inhabit the characters inside that world, we would be living there, but we actually are in the future. And so I mentioned this other film, The 13th Floor, which I don't know if you've seen it.
I have.
But you've seen it, right? So it starts off in 1999, for those that haven't, and they create an ancestor simulation of, I think it's 1937 Los Angeles. And the non-player characters are in there. By the way, NPCs and RPG versions are not exclusive. I mean, you can have both in any game. In fact, that's what makes the game interesting, is to have both. And so they go and they inhabit particular characters in that world. And so it could be future humans. Some people think it's an alien civilization that's trying to go back to humans. Some think we have multiple timelines. And so we are running simulations in order to see what happens. We can come back to that in a minute. But I tend to, personally believe that it's closer to this idea of a soul or a disincarnate being, which is then having this experience as a particular type of biological being, which is us, humans, as our avatars.
Are you familiar with the hypnotist Dolores Cannon and her work?
I've heard of her a lot. I haven't actually read her books. In fact, I just recently, someone recommended it to me. There was a book she has about her kind of hypnotizing for between death. Is it kind of the in-between state that she talks about? Or
I'm not super familiar with her work, but what we've talked about is that she talked about that there are NPCs living among us in this world. And she said something like, we can't figure out who they are, so don't even try it.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so people always ask me, and of course, NPC has come to have a slightly different connotation today on the internet. So when they say somebody's an NPC, well, they're maybe not necessarily saying the person is AI, but they're saying that the person is just repeating the mantras of what's often called the narrative matrix, right? They're repeating what the media has told them. And so it's become this kind of pejorative term. But when we talk about NPCs in the simulation hypothesis, we're talking about actual NPCs. And so I always tell people, don't assume that anyone is an NPC. Now, it's possible that there are certain experiences that are set up for you. And I view our karma as kind of a database of quests and achievements. So if you play video games today, you always have these different quests and achievements. And if you design games, you know that there's actually like a tree or a map of quests that says at the beginning of the game, these are the quests that are open to you. And once you complete this quest, you could do one of these other ones. Maybe you've learned to, use a crossbow. Now you can go and fight the Goblin King or whatever the case may be. But it's like a hierarchy of quests. And I believe karma is like that. It's a database that has a list of tasks, achievements, experiences that we want to have or that we need to have. And that as we go through life, we're adding to this database, right? And this database is there for us in the next life. And we kind of choose. And we can talk about this idea of the life preview, which I think is as interesting as the life review when we talk about the world being a video game, right? And so we can have these experiences, and sometimes we need to have these experiences with other players. So in a video game, you have this idea of multiplayer quests or guilds or raids where everybody gets on to say World of Warcraft at the same time, and they all go on this mission together. And I think we're constantly having the player is aware of what's going on, almost as if we're sitting in a theater and looking at not just a 2D screen, but a holographic image of what's going on in this physical world. But usually just in the same way that when we're at a theater, we get so engrossed by the movie, or when we put on a headset, we get so engrossed by the game that we forget it's just a game. But there are choices being made, and maybe there's people that we're supposed to be in a romantic relationship with, or an antagonistic relationship with, or an experience of a certain type of suffering or certain type of achievements. And perhaps those are being implemented for us. The multiplayer quests are being implemented where we all choose yes, to that quest, if you will, behind the scenes, right? Just as in a video game, you can have what your characters are doing in what I call the rendered world, and then you can be sending private messages to the player of that character which don't appear in the actual gameplay itself. It's outside of the rendered world. And so this database and these messages and these agreements, they in a video game, they're displayed in what we call a HUD, or heads-up display, where they appear around the rendered world, kind of like in the Zoom. If I were to send you a private message in chat, it wouldn't appear in the video here, but you would still get it. And so I believe we are setting up these experiences. Now, some of those experiences may require NPCs, but I always tell people, don't assume that anyone is an NPC, because if you do, then you'll start to treat them in a negative way. And what if they actually are another player? So let's just assume they're a player. One woman said to me, I think my husband's an NPC. And I said, I wouldn't go down that road. I encourage you, particularly when you think of the life review as the purpose of the game, right? What if that's a character that you're supposed to, be a certain way towards, and you'll start to act differently if you think of them as only an NPC.
Have you ever considered the possibility that everyone is an NPC?
I have, and that's the other version. Like if you go to the ends of this axis, right? One end, everyone is a player with an avatar, and at the other end, everyone is an NPC within the game. And so, that is, like I said, when many academics talk about the simulation theory, that's what they're talking about. There's a fellow named Nick Bostrom, who really is the grandfather of modern simulation theory, who's a philosopher at Oxford. And he came to this through AI. And he said, if we can get AI to the point where it can simulate all of the brain functions, and he estimated how many neurons we have and how many operations, then we could create a whole civilization of people that were basically NPCs. He didn't use that terminology. That's a video game terminology. He just used this idea of AI post-human civilizations. And then that we would create not just one, but lots of simulations, okay, to the point where we, meaning whoever the technological civilization is that created this AI, would create AI civilizations. And you're already starting to see this. There was a post recently, a little video of a company that created something called Project Sid, which had 1,000 NPCs in Minecraft, and they started to create their own little societies and their own religions. And there was also a group at Google and Stanford. They wrote a paper called Generative Agents, where they created a little city called Smallville. Now, these were all, kind of 2D characters or Minecraft blocky characters. And I'm sure there were all kinds of guardrails and parameters, but they started to have these emergent, interesting social behaviors. And so we're on a path to become a civilization like that. And the idea was that any civilization that reaches what I call the simulation point, and what Bostrom called post-human, would create maybe billions of these sims or civilizations. And so if you're in a simulated world, or if you're in a world and there's a billion simulated worlds and there's only one physical world, which are you more likely to be if you can't tell the difference? And so this was the logic that caused Elon Musk. He has a famous there's a famous clip of him on the internet saying that the chances that we are in base reality, not in a simulation, is 1 in billions, which means the chances that we're in a simulation is billions to 1. Why? Because there's a billion simulated worlds and only one real world. So we're probably in here. Again, if you can't tell the difference. And that's the point of, when I put on the headset and was playing the ping pong game, I was trying to figure out how long would it take us to get to that point where we would create virtual worlds that were indistinguishable from physical reality, but also in the formal definition of this thing I call the simulation point, with AI characters that are indistinguishable from other characters controlled by players. There's something that I call the metaverse Turing test, and this is, some of this is in my book, The Simulation Hypothesis. Some of it is going to be in a second edition of the book, which will be out sometime next year. But the metaverse Turing test is if you can go into a video game and you can have 2 characters, one of whom is controlled by a person and one of which is controlled by AI, and you go around and you do things and you talk to each other and you can't tell the difference, then the AI has passed the metaverse Turing test. Now, if you look at the numbers of these civilizations and this whole statistical argument, which is called the simulation argument, then almost all of the people in those simulations are NPCs. So I have considered that. However, I think the best evidence that we are in an RPG simulation, a role-playing game simulation, is in fact near-death experiences and paranormal phenomena. that we have, many of which could be explained by being players inside a simulation.
Even though I've heard over 700, none of them obviously are alike, and I get outliers that still make me question things. For example, I have had a few people say that they woke up in something like a pod during their near-death experience. Whereas, many people are like an orb or just energy on the other side. So that's where it can even get confusing on my end.
Well, I'll tell you a story that I haven't told publicly before about myself. And that, I may write a book about this. So this was not a traditional NDE, but one of the things that caused me to write this book was that I had a big health crisis almost 6 years ago now. And I was at the height of my career in Silicon Valley. I had sold my company. I was becoming an investor. I was running a program for startups at MIT, which, is a prestigious thing to be doing. And I wanted to raise this big venture capital fund. And I thought, okay, that's my future in Silicon Valley. And then I had this health crisis and I actually had to have heart surgery. And that, of course, stopped everything I was thinking about from my career. And it was during this time that I was recovering. It was supposed to be a relatively short recovery, but it ended up being a recovery that dragged on, not just for months, but for years. And so what happened was after this open heart surgery, a few months later, I'd start to feel better and I tried to jump back into the business world and something else would go wrong and I had to go back and get another heart operation. Luckily, not another open heart surgery, but like stents, which are much easier to put in. But this happened enough that I realized that there was a message that I was getting. And when I was recovering, this message came across to me quite clearly in a set of visualizations that happened to me. And I say it's not a traditional near-death experience because it didn't happen during the actual surgery when I was out. There was this recovery period, and for a period of 9 months, I mean, all I could really do, I couldn't really work, but all I could really do was I had enough strength to get in a cab, go to Starbucks, and spend a few hours every day writing. And the message that I got during these experiences that I had, these recovery experiences, I got a message saying that part of your story, part of your mission in this life is to be a writer. And you know this, but you seem to be spending all your time over here in the business world. And you're basically supposed to write. That's what you're supposed to do. And so in the previous 10 years, I mean, I had written a couple of books in like say the 9 years before the surgery. But in the 9 months after the surgery, I ended up writing two books, one of which went to a fairly prestigious academic publisher, and the other of which was The Simulation Hypothesis, which has gone on to be a bestseller. But I wrote it because it brought together all these different threads of my life, the technology, the video games, the science, but also all the different spiritual experiences and consciousness experiences that I've had. I've explored a lot of these. I was kind of living a dual life between being in Silicon Valley during the day, and I'd try out shamanic journeying or lucid dreaming or go off to the Monroe Institute or try different Buddhist meditation techniques, in the evenings and on the weekends. And this was the only model that really allowed me to bring all these things together. Okay, but now the experience itself. So I've talked about this aspect of how I believe it was a course correction in my life. There was a purpose for what was a pretty traumatic experience. And honestly, I'm still recovering from it 6 years later. I'm barely at the point that I was health-wise. But it led me in a different direction. And if you had asked me back in high school what I was going to do as a career, I would say I'm going to be a computer, software entrepreneur, and then I'm going to be a writer. I mean, I just kind of knew that in the back of my mind. And I believe it was part of the script that I had agreed to before starting in the game itself. Like just as in Dungeons and Dragons, we choose a character, we choose a race. I'm old enough, and I think you are too, to remember the actual tabletop game where,
Yeah, I used to play.
Yeah, we used to, and now it's actually become popular again because of Stranger Things.
Yeah.
But you choose a character, you choose a race, you choose a profession, you choose, a storyline and a backstory. And I believe that's kind of what happens before we come in to this particular character. We choose a general storyline. We're still free to make decisions along the way. But the experience that happened to me was that I ended up, I would be sitting on the couch or laying on the couch, which is all I could do. And this started in the hospital where I was laying in the hospital bed trying to recover. I would just naturally kind of slip into this alternate, I almost call it alternate reality. And in this, I was in this alpine scenery with this very serene lake. And there was what looked almost like a Tibetan monastery type of building. And there were these, what looked to me like Tibetan monks. And they were working on my body, on my energetic body. And they were like kind of sending me energy and helping me heal. And then I'd sit outside in these sort of lawn chairs, and I'd watch these Buddhist monks surfing, and I would be sitting with this what in the Tibetan traditions they call a tulku, which is like a little kid who's the reincarnation of a advanced spirit, and he would like tell me things about life, and he'd show me like on a chessboard all these different paths we could take through life, and if you do this, then this has to change, and if you do this, and that's where I got this strong message that I needed to write. That was part of the mission in life. And I slipped in and out of this easily. And I wasn't like totally unconscious. So it was kind of like a shamanic journey, which is something I used to do with the drumming, but it would just happen while I was lying there trying to recover from this. And if you've ever seen open heart surgery, it's pretty much one of the biggest cuts you can have to your body. So it's a very traumatic physical experience too. But they told me that I wasn't dead, so I didn't go all the way to where people go in their near-death experiences, that this was a halfway house, if you will. I refer to it as the monks on the borderlands, right? And they were there to help heal somebody who's not ready to go all the way. So I was not completely disconnected from my body, but I was kind of in this in-between state, and I could, they could open up a portal and summon my guides and there was all kinds of other things that happened, some of which I don't even remember, to be honest now. But back then it was crystal clear because I was just going in and out of these things. And then later I realized towards the end of this 9 months, this recovery period, that was another simulation that had been set up for me because I had studied a lot of Buddhist traditions. I grew up as a Muslim, but studied a lot of Buddhism and Hinduism. And that was the imagery that I needed. And I found that I could go on this boat in this alpine lake, and I would end up in these other sort of locks, if you will, right? If you think of like Scotland or Norway, one of these type places, and they'd have different buildings, that were shaped like a mosque or shaped like something else. And basically each of these was another simulation that was set up for me because it was what I needed at the time. And so we could have this experience where there's another simulation outside of this one, which could in fact be a case where we're in a pod trying to have one of these experiences. But perhaps then beyond that, it gets closer to, I think, where people go. So I think we may have stacked simulations. So this is kind of a long-winded story, but I thought it was important to share that. That's when I came to the realization that even what people are saying when they go outside is also a metaphor, if you will, so that they can understand what's going on and what's happening. And for me, it was like this simulation of a healing temple, if you will.
Since you've become a writer, have you noticed a lot of positive things happening to you that gives you confirmation that this is the direction that you should be in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have this idea that sometimes we're being guided to do certain things. And you can take a spiritual view of that, and you can say, well, there's guides that are actually guiding us. You can take a non-spiritual view and say, these are types of synchronicity, in the simulation that are pointing you in a particular direction. You could also take more of a quantum physics point of view. So, part of the reason I wrote this book was that when I looked into quantum physics, I realized that they were telling us basically that there is no physical world, that the world consists primarily of information that gets rendered for us. And that's exactly how we do things in a video game. And there was a famous physicist named John Wheeler who died, I think, at the turn of the century here, but he was one of the last physicists alive. He was at Princeton. He worked with Einstein, he was Bohr. So he was like one of the few connections to the beginnings of quantum physics and relativity. And before he died, I think in the 80s or 90s, he came out with this phrase, it from bit. And what he said was that, when you look at any physical object, right, maybe this coffee cup here, that it's not really solid, but if you keep going, like those Russian dolls, if you keep opening them, there's nothing at the bottom except for what they call properties of a particle. And that's all a particle is properties. And these properties are basically answers to a series of yes/no questions. And that is basically bits of information. That's what a bit is. It takes on a value of a 0 or a 1, a yes or a no. And he said it from bit. So if there's anything that's in it comes from a bit. And so that, solidified in my view that this whole reality was built on information. And then that information has to be presented to us in the same way that you and I are not really talking right now, are we? I am talking to my computer. It's being translated into bits, is being sent to your computer, and then that is being rendered, if you will, into a video and audio, and then you are talking back to it. That is exactly what we're doing in the physical world. Each of us is kind of doing, our own version of what's being rendered in the world itself. So that's what led me into kind of that world. Although now I think I've lost the thread of your original question here.
That's all right. What I want to move on to is that to play this game, we have to have amnesia, or it wouldn't be an effective game, and not remember the other side. But why in this time period is so much information coming out about the Matrix? Is it possible that we're all stuck in the game and we're trying to free ourselves from it?
It's very possible. Just to follow up on what I was saying earlier, I remembered your original question. So where I was going with the quantum physics stuff was that if you think of guiding clues, which I call clues in the treasure hunt, right? If you think of Indiana Jones and you think of one of his films, he never gets all the clues at once. He gets one clue and he has to follow that clue, and that takes him to the next clue. And eventually that leads him to the treasure. And so since I've become a writer, I've had many of these types of experiences, which has led to me talking about this quite broadly, in talking about it in Google, for example, where they don't usually talk about spiritual stuff. And you have a lot of left brain people, but you have a lot of spiritual people there too. But it has definitely led me in interesting directions that I had not expected to go. And so for, about the last 3 to 5 years, I was mostly a writer. And then once I had started to write a few books, I decided to go back into academia, which I felt was another part of the story that I had laid out for myself. So one way you can think of these clues in quantum physics perspective, there's one view that says that we have these multiple possible futures, and they are sending back information to us, to the present. And how could they send that information back to us if the future doesn't exist? Well, it must exist. Well, what does that mean for it to exist? And if we think of it as simulating these futures, we can run the simulation forward, and that we can say, oh, this is what would happen if I did that. This is what would happen if I did that particular path. That is one possible explanation. That's we're getting information from our future selves about where to navigate if we went down this path or that path. So that was kind of wrapping up the answer to the previous question.
All right. Should I repeat my question?
It was about why are we waking up now, right? And why are so many people getting this information?
Yeah, why, yeah, exactly. Why now, especially if we're not supposed to remember that this is a simulation?
Well, first of all, I don't know that it's happening now and it hasn't happened before. This idea of my life flashed before me, right, is kind of how people talked about how we talk about the life review now with near-death experiences. And I feel that, all of the various scriptures, as I said earlier, speak in these metaphors. And so I feel like this information has been out there, and that forgetfulness, is a key part of coming into this life when we agree to play this particular aspect of the game. I mean, there is, in the Greek traditions, there is Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And when souls incarnate, if you look at, say, Plato's The Myth of which talks a little bit about reincarnation, you cross this river of forgetfulness. And in the Chinese traditions, they have Meng Po, who's the goddess of forgetfulness, and she brews the tea of forgetfulness, which you drink either before or after. And in both of these traditions, I'm translating it as forgetfulness, but you could also translate it as kind of oblivion, to try to forget about certain experiences before or after. But I believe that's always been the case, that is part of the enjoyment of the game, is you can't really enjoy being this character if you're constantly thinking about the previous character and what happened to you, before. In fact, in the Quran, they have a line that's similar to the idea of Maya or illusion from the Indian, Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Maya, of course, means illusion, but it's a more subtle definition than that. Maya is the force of illusion by which we forget that what we're seeing is not real. It's almost the analogy that I've heard used that I like is it's like a magic show. If you go to a magic show, you know that guy is not really cutting the woman in half, but you want to be amazed. And so part of the enjoyment of the show comes from this fact that you're not aware, but part of you is still aware, right? That it's a magic show. You know it's a magic show. And so I think that there's a line in the Quran that's actually very similar. And they talk about el-gururi in Arabic, which means a delusion. And so they say, we have set up this world for you as a delusion, but el-gururi matao, which means an enjoyable delusion. Enjoyable in the sense that, the same sense that if you go into a horror show, you want to be scared, right? Or you go to a magic show, you want to be amazed. And so in the Quran, it also says we have set up this world as a game, as a pastime, as a sport. And so they keep using this terminology of play, but forgetfulness is a key part of that. And so I believe we end up forgetting. That said, I think it's always been the case that certain people have been telling us all along that we are souls in this game. But as we've gotten more and more rational, particularly in the Western traditions, that has become a taboo subject. But I'm in academia now, and that has become a bit of an academic taboo. You can study religions as a sociological phenomenon to say this is what these people believe, but you're not supposed to study it as what we call an ontological phenomenon, meaning that they could be studying something that is real, or these miracles could have actually happened, or that the angel Gabriel could have actually spoken to the Prophet Muhammad, or various traditions have various stories of things that might have happened. And so as we become more rational, like 500 years ago, Galileo was prosecuted by the church for his ideas about the material world. But today we've replaced the church with more of a techno-scientific authority, which rests on academics, and with power with the government. There's this correlation, and they crack down on ideas which are not part of the materialistic view, or what we call the epistemology of the world. And so I think what's happening now is that individuals are starting to get this information, but to share it more. Whereas in the past, we didn't have the internet, right? Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I said, well, I think if people want religion, they should just sit and watch YouTube of near-death experiencers. Well, we didn't have YouTube back then, right? And so there might have been people having these individual experiences, but they were told they were crazy. It's just firings of neurons in the brain. And so I think there just wasn't as much sharing of information as there is now. I think that's true of other interesting, paranormal phenomenon, whether it's UFOs or ghosts or other phenomenon that people have experienced, like the Mandela effect. Right? The Mandela effect, which is when a subset of people remember a different past. And I write about the Mandela effect in my second simulation book, The Simulated Multiverse, which is this idea. We're all comfortable to think there's this idea of multiple possible futures. At least we can understand it intellectually. What we can't understand intellectually is there might be multiple possible pasts, which I take to be multiple runs of the simulation, trying out different things and branches of time coming together and merging. But the Mandela effect only emerged as a phenomenon in 2009, when a blogger named Fiona Broom was at a Comic-Con type conference in Atlanta called Dragon Con, and there were the Star Trek actors were on stage, and some of the audience members remembered a Star Trek episode that the actor said, no, we never had such an episode. And if you know Star Trek fans, right, Trekkers or Trekkies, depending on what, they know their Star Trek sometimes better than the actors, right? But this episode was never there. And so she began to formulate this phenomenon of people remembering something concretely that other people don't remember. Now, that is a phenomenon that could not have really come about before the internet because people weren't sharing. So you couldn't find enough subset of people that remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 80s, which is what, the term was coined after that idea that some people remember. And so I think it's partly a communication issue. And, it partly, I think there's just a lot more information available out there, but I think people may have been aware of this all along. But the majority of people, uh, we agree to forget it, and then when anyone remembers, it's like if somebody kept nudging you, and you're watching this movie, you're watching Lord of the Rings, and someone keeps nudging you to remind you about something else. That this is just a movie. You're like, leave me alone. I want to, really enjoy this world that I'm engrossed in.
Personally speaking, is this just a theory for you, or do you feel that you're certain that this is what is?
Well, so it started off as a theory, but the further I got into it, particularly into the spiritual traditions and the quantum physics, the more certain I became of several aspects of this, which is one, that the world is made of information. And recently I was at the University of Cambridge, in Cambridge in the UK, although I've lived in Cambridge in Massachusetts for a long time. And I met this Nobel Prize winning physicist, and we were talking about this idea. And I said, the first cornerstone of it is that the world is information. And he said, well, that's not a controversial idea anymore among physicists, right? In fact, there's a whole branch of physics now called digital physics, which is that the world is made of information. Now, if the world is made of information, then it has to be rendered for us somehow, because it doesn't look like ones and zeros, right? It looks like an actual three-dimensional world, just like a video game is really just bits of information. That's all it is, but it gets rendered for us as, this medieval castle or whatever game we happen to be playing. So, the first is that I'm fairly certain the world is consisting of information that gets computed as we go. The second is that this information is being rendered for us. And the third is that the world is a kind of hoax, right? There's something about the world that isn't real. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't feel real. It doesn't mean we don't experience pain while we're here. But I'm fairly certain that what we're experiencing now is a subset of reality. The physical world is a subset of reality. So in that sense, people always ask me, what's the percentage likelihood that we live in a simulation? And when I wrote this book 5 years ago, I would have said, I think it's at least 50%. And now I'd say it's a lot more than that. It's more than 70%. Now, whether you want to take this literally as a computer simulation, well, that gets a little trickier, because you have to look at what do we mean by computers. Our computers today are pretty primitive compared to what they might be 1,000 years from now. I mean, not 100 years, 1,000 years from now. In fact, some people say, quantum computing is more like what the universe does. It's a giant quantum computer where we can simulate multiple parallel realities in what's called the quantum multiverse, all at the same time, in order to have an experience. So I think that's up for debate. But the idea that the world is a type of simulation or video game, and that is the best metaphor to date that we have. Maybe 1,000 years from now, we'll have another metaphor. But 1,000 years ago, even 100 years ago, if you had said this, they would not understand that metaphor. In fact, one of my books is called Wisdom of the Yogi, which is about Paramhansa Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which was one of the best-selling books back in the 60s and 70s that introduced many Westerners to the Indian ideas. And Swami Yogananda was one of the first Indian swamis to come to the U.S. and live in the U.S. He came in 1920, so it was literally a little over 100 years ago that he came and started talking about these different ideas. And he decided that it was time for a new metaphor, so that people in contemporary, the modern world at the time, the 1920s and 30s, could understand these ancient Indian ideas of Maya and illusion and karma. And he said, the world is like a movie projector, right? It's just like a movie. And we are all just playing our parts in this movie. And we have to look away from the screen to see the light and go towards the source. And that's what he encouraged his students to do. But that was a modern technology metaphor that could not have been made even 100 years before he came around. And so I think if Yogananda were alive today, he would say, it's like a movie, but it's an interactive one. We have a script, but we can change the script. We're watching the movie, but we're also the actors in the movie. And basically, what does that sound like? It sounds like a multiplayer, massively multiplayer online role-playing video game. So I believe it's the best metaphor of reality that we have at the moment. And certainly for the next 100 years, I think that will be so.
If you're using this theory, have you ever been able to take these ideas and manifest it or manipulate this simulation in your benefit?
Well, now you're touching on this idea of manifestation, right? And I believe that if we look at all the literature about manifestation and you can create your own reality, I think there's something like that going on. There's already a force that is at work in the simulation, creating our experiences for us. And I call that the engine of karma or the quest engine, right? And so it's a force that already creates situations in our lives based upon what we might want to do. And so if you think of manifestation, and I look back at my own life, I've been, fairly successful at manifesting certain things, whether it's, success in Silicon Valley, wealth, etc. There are times when the manifestation happened pretty easily. And there are other times when the manifestation just wouldn't happen at all, right? Despite how many times I would try visualizing it or manifesting it. And I believe it's because there's a part of us that's actually looking at these paths in the future, like I was talking about earlier. And so it tries out different realities. And the ones that are more likely for us to happen in quantum physics, there's this idea of a probability wave. And when we observe something, the probability wave collapses to one possibility. But I believe that we are already doing this. And this ties to the life preview, right? Well, there's this, and some near-death experiencers I know have reported that they see future events during the NDE. And sometimes um, they're like seeing what would happen in different scenarios. Like the woman, I forget her name now, she was struck by lightning and she saw what would happen to her kids outside of church, and she saw what would happen to her kids if she didn't go back. Now, how could she see what had happened, what was going to happen in the future, unless it played out somehow, right? There had to be some process that played that out, and she decided to come back because she was given the choice. Or there's the case of the Iraqi soldier. Her name is slipping my mind at the moment, but she wrote a great book about it, where she was hit by an IED, and not only did she, I think, have a life review, but she had this review where they would say, well, what if you couldn't walk? This is what would happen. What if you were blind? This is what would happen. Now, this sounds a little morose to us, right? Because here she is, but she said it was a playful, fun thing. What if you recovered, mostly after a year? What would happen in your life? And so she could actually see these different possible futures play out as if she was watching a movie or a game. And then, she ended up choosing a particular one, which led her, to write the book. And I feel like with manifestation, it's more a sense of getting the clues of these possible futures. Like I find the manifestation works when the image comes to me rather than me trying to create an image, if you will. And that's because I'm observing one of these future realities, and somehow I'm giving that more probability from a quantum physics perspective. So, I mean, I do integrate this idea that we're in a simulation into our life, into my life. And it's not just through manifestation, it's also when bad things happen, right? Many of us go through life. I mentioned Swami Yogananda earlier. He said, ceaseless joy is not the nature of this world, right? He said, when you are ready for the beatings of the world, meditate at night so you can go back the next day to take the beatings of the world, the warp and woof of Maya, as he called it. And so when bad things happen to us, how do we interpret that? And I say, well, in a video game, the more advanced players tend to take on the more difficult challenges, right? There's a difficulty level that we give to ourselves, and you only are ready for a more difficult quest, once you've gotten to a certain point, and the really difficult quests, the boss battles, you can't get to those right away. You have to wait. And so when something bad happens, you can view that as an experience that is a more difficult experience in the simulation, but it's one that also may meant to teach you something. That may be one of those off the quest that you pulled off of the list of quests that are out there in the karmic database. And that's how I view, like, when my heart surgery happened. It was both a necessary correction, but is also a very difficult experience because, I mean, overall, I had pretty good life up to that point in time, right? Things just kind of went well. I mean, not that I didn't work hard. I worked very hard, many hours in startups, but things generally worked out, pretty well compared to a lot of things that could have happened. And so that kind of reset my whole perspective on life and difficult situations when people go through them.
Is it true that they can't prove that we're not in a simulation?
Well, that's an open debate, right? So there's a philosopher from New York University, NYU, named David Chalmers. And he also has written about virtual reality. And he makes the point that if the simulation is perfect, it's so good that there would be no way for us to figure out that we're in a simulation. But there are other people who believe that any computational process has glitches, right, and bugs in the simulation. And as a computer programmer, I know that's true. You can always find weird behavior and glitches. And sometimes there's, what are called in video games Easter eggs, right, which are placed there intentionally so that if you discover it, you realize, oh yeah, this is a Easter egg. Like there was the game Adventure from Atari, and you and I were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, I
That's how
played
we
that
started
game.
playing. Yeah, there was actually one of the first and most famous Easter eggs was you went to a certain place within this world. It was just a dot. For people that haven't played Adventure, your player was like this dot that moved around this maze, very blocky 2D. But there was this place where you could say, if you did the right sequence of things, it brought up this little message that said, created by, I think the guy's name was Warren Robinet or something like that. Sorry if I mispronounced that name there.
Hmm.
But it was because Atari wouldn't put the names of the developer on the game. So he inserted this Easter egg and that became a thing. Game developers would insert Easter eggs in games. So I believe we can find glitches. And there are folks who are trying to prove that we're in a simulation. There's a gentleman named Tom Campbell who wrote a book called My Big Toe. And he was a former NASA physicist who also worked closely with Bob Monroe at the Monroe Institute. And so he has a very interesting perspective. And he's been talking about this idea of virtual reality for years, much longer than I have. And he has raised money, and they're running some experiments at Cal Poly. And I went down there to see the experiments. And in fact, there's a conference in Huntsville, Alabama at the end of September that I'll be speaking at called Doorway to the Future, which is being put on by Tom Campbell's organization that he set up called the Center for the Unification of Science and Consciousness, CUSAC.org. And so they're trying to run some quantum experiments to show that, in fact, what's happening is that you need a conscious player, just like in a video game, to render the world. It's not just a matter of measurement. And those experiments are ongoing. There are other folks who think that you can use AI to find glitches to break out of the simulation. So I would say that's an open debate. But to me, again, the most obvious things are the glitches that we already see, right? Whether we see people see ghosts and they see these characters rerunning the same experiences, right? Which I guess is called, residual apparitions as opposed to apparitions which are trying to talk to you. And so when you see these things, you start to realize, okay, I mean, you can't really explain that in a physical world, but in a simulation, you can explain it easily because you're just rerunning old data in memory. You're just rerunning that. And there's a process in computer science we call garbage collection, where we leave all the old data there until we need that memory for something else. And so it's very easy for a process to just glitch and rerun this old data if it isn't cleaned up. And that, I think, is one way to explain like these residual apparitions. But you can also have people from the other side communicating. I mean, there are all these things that I think are probably good evidence, on top of the information aspect that are coming from the paranormal. So I think it is possible to realize we're in a simulation. Now, you can prove it to yourself. Can you prove it to other people? I don't know. There was some producers that reached out to me. They were going to do a show on Netflix. I don't think the show has come about, but it was about people in a small town who look up one day and they see this big giant sign in the sky that says "Sky Not Found," which is what happens in video games when you can't find a particular graphics resource, and so it just appears as an error or a glitch. I don't think we'll have that kind of an obvious glitch, but I think there are much more subtle glitches that are there that we can realize.
For anybody out there who's watching, if you ever get a chance to try something like the Oculus Rex, it's amazing because one time I used my son's, and for a while I was at this like pool party and it was so realistic. And then I was doing a walking tour of Dubai and it was super, super realistic. And then I took the glasses off and I was back here and I was actually kind of disappointed, like, oh, I'm back here. So it makes me think about, what near-death experiencers go through when they're back on the other side, like, oh, I'm back.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the Oculus from Facebook, which has changed its name to Meta, which is because of something called the metaverse, which is meant to be a 3D virtual world based on science fiction ideas. I wrote an article for Scientific American last year that said, from the metaverse to the matrix. It basically said our ideas of the metaverse, if we keep developing them, will eventually get us to the matrix, where you're no longer putting on a headset, but you're using a brain-computer interface, which goes into the back of the head, as it did in the Matrix. But the other new device is the Apple Vision Pro, which is definitely worth trying, because what it does is it re-renders the room around you, but it adds things, right? Just like here in Zoom, we could easily change our background. Well, it does this when you're looking around and adds things onto the environment. I think these technologies are still a little bit awkward. You get tired from having them on your head. So, but people should definitely try them. And I think they're getting better and better to the point where you will get like this size, the size of your glasses or my glasses, where you can have a full augmented or virtual reality. And you can be immersed, but you might still be able to remember there's part of you that's outside this virtual reality. So I encourage people to try that as well.
Even though I felt like when I came back to this reality, I was disappointed, the majority of near-death experiencers comment that the other side is more real than here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. And I've heard those reports as well. And I think if you think about the games that we create, they are becoming more and more realistic, right? But if you go back to games from the 80s and 90s, they were 8-bit and then 16-bit games. So they were getting a little more realistic, but clearly what 8-bit means or 16-bit means, for those who don't know, it means that those are the number of bits that can represent values. Like you can have 2 to the power of 8, which is like 256 or whatever. Different colors that can be represented by 1 byte of information. And so when you have pixels on the screen, you have RGB, red, green, blue, and those are used. And so the number of total colors you can have inside a game is limited by the number of bits. And I remember when 16-bit colors came about, and there were advertisements that said, oh, we can have millions of colors, right? But really, you're using a subset of those colors inside the game. And those colors are a subset of what we actually see in the physical world. Like even digital pictures still don't convey the same sense of grandeur of looking out at the Grand Canyon, right? Even you take a digital picture, you won't really get that same level of light quality and the feeling that comes along with it. And so I think that's because we're in a simulation, we're limited in the colors and the sounds and frequencies that we can produce here. And when these near-death experiencers go outside, they're suddenly exposed in the same way that if I was playing, Mario Brothers and everything is blocky, or Minecraft, and then I step out here and I realize, oh, everything is so colorful, and it has many more colors, many more possibilities. There are colors in the real world that cannot be produced in Minecraft, for example, let's say. And that's exactly what the near-death experiencers tell us. So I think it has to do with this digital limited reality that we're in.
What do you think's happening when we're dreaming?
Well, dreams is a great and interesting subject. And, I talked about metaphors. And of course, the dream has been one of the longest used metaphors about the nature of reality, particularly in Buddhism, but also in Hinduism and other religions as well. And in fact, the Buddha, some woman asked him after he became enlightened, what are you? And he said, I am Bud, which meant I am awake, which means the rest of us is asleep and the whole thing is a dream. But when I lay out the stages to the simulation point, when we can create something like the Matrix, in my book, I also talk about, well, we already have all of that technology, more or less. It's in our heads. They're called dreams. We can create this dream world. We forget that there's a part of us outside the world. We have these NPC characters running around. We can even, if you believe certain stories of dreaming, we can even have shared dreams with other players, if you will, multiplayer dreams. And they are like little simulated worlds. And in fact, there's a whole branch of Buddhism called uh, dream yoga or Hosana practices. And the idea is you become awake in the dream, lucid dreaming, as we call it, but you also stay aware as you fall asleep. So you go through the process from wakefulness to dreaming, and then you realize the world in your dream world is just a fantasy world, and that there's another part of you outside. And that is used as a training and a metaphor for realizing that the physical world is a dream as well. And so I think that that's a powerful metaphor, but I think it's also a way that we process information. I view them as kind of mini simulations we create for ourselves to help clean up. And in fact, in the Buddhist traditions, there's two types of karma. One is called karmic traces, which are like little traces, which you can resolve in dreams. And then there's bigger karma, which you have to resolve in the dream of life, of waking life, if you will. So, we've all had dreams where we saw something, an image that stuck with us from the day, or we saw a movie, and then part of that image shows up in part of our dreams later that night. And that's what they would call a karmic trace. It made an impression, and they need to clean that up. And the way they clean it up is by having it kind of release and show itself within the dream. And we can even have certain experiences. So I think dreams are a very powerful very powerful metaphor for this idea that the world is a hoax, if you will.
Do you think that they ever rerun the simulation over and over again, but changing certain elements of it? Like, for example, perhaps the pyramids are left over from a previous simulation, and whoever created it just left it in because we can't figure out how to recreate it.
I think it's very possible. And, I stumbled into this through what I was talking about earlier, the Mandela effect, where a friend of mine who was from MIT as well, and usually when I talk about weird things like UFOs or the Mandela effect or NDEs, it's not with my classmates from MIT. They're usually very left-brained. And he said, well, the simulation theory you're talking about is a great explanation for the Mandela effect. And I kind of went down that rabbit hole. And I also had interviewed the wife of Philip K. Dick, science fiction writer whose books, were used as the basis for Blade Runner, Man in the High Castle. And in the Man in the High Castle, there's an alternate version of our timeline where the Japanese and the Germans won World War II, and they divided America between them. And there's this person who's in that timeline who's able to jump timelines. And so I went deep into this idea of running a simulation because Philip K. Dick actually gave a speech in Metz, France. There's a famous clip from that speech, which is used a lot online, where he said, in 1977, he said, we are living in a computer programmed reality. And the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality. Such a change in variable is a clue. And we would have a sense of deja vu, like we were rerunning the same events again. And so he came up with this idea that you could change variables and rerun events. And he believes that that timeline he described in The Man in the High Castle was a real timeline where Germany and Japan won World War II. And for whatever reason, that was unwound, or perhaps it's still a timeline that exists, and we are now on this other branch. And I do delve heavily into this in my second simulation book, The Simulated Multiverse, which is all about this idea that we could be running multiple simulations and multiple timelines. And all we have to do is change certain bits of information. And there's this idea in chaos theory that a small change in initial conditions will result in wildly different outcomes. And that's why we need to run multiple simulations to see what might happen. But if it's being run in a computational environment, you could easily have stuff from these previous runs of the simulation, and people could remember previous runs of the simulation as well.
I just had Nick Gold on, who was part of the Galileo project with Harvard, and I think you're part of that project, or were.
Yeah.
So how are you explaining UFOs? Are you explaining it the same way as deja vu within the simulation?
Not necessarily. So yeah, I'm an advisor to the Galileo project, so not part of the core team, but they kind of keep me up to date on things that are going on with it. But a lot of my interpretation of UFOs as being both physical and beyond physical comes from my ideas around simulation theory, where you can rent what happens sometimes. And I think if you look at some of the edge cases, you start to see some interesting phenomenon. Like Jacques Vallée told me that he had cases where one person saw the UFO and the person sitting next to them didn't see the UFO. Or, Gary Nolan from Stanford, who also has been heavy in the subject, has told me cases where one person saw a disc and another person saw a cylinder. Right? So they saw different shapes, even though they were right next to each other. And so that to me leads to this idea that these are projected into our world. And we do this in video games all the time, where maybe you're an advanced player at level 30 and I'm a player at level 2. We're standing in the same field and you see a dragon and I don't see it. And you say, it's right there. I say, no, there's no dragon there. Why? Because we're individually rendering this onto our personal computers or our phones. So I think there's an overlap between these two topics.
Rizwan, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is zenentrepreneur.com. The title is based on my first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship. And there are contact forms, and they can download free chapters of my books there as well.
Do you have anything else you're working on that you want people to know about?
Well, working on a bunch of different things, but right now, primarily, I think the thing that people would be interested in is there's going to be a new version of my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, coming out next year, which is going to have lots of updates. But the first version will still be available till about December, so I encourage people to go get it, because that first version may end up being, sort of a classic version, if you will.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Well, in the video game industry, there's a guy named Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari. And he had a rule on what makes a good game. And he said, make it simple to play, but difficult to master. Because if it's simple to play, or if it's difficult to play, people won't play it. But if it's easy to master, they'll stop playing it. And so the game of life, I think, matches that. It's simple to play, we're here, but it's difficult to master. And that's what keeps the game of life interesting for us.
Rizwan, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.